Good morning, and thank you for coming to the Center for Strategic and International Studies for our briefing on the status of the six-party talks. I know everybody's busy today and wants to get to it, so I'll throw it over to Dr. Green, who's going to give some opening remarks.
Thank you. I know there's a lot going on today, and with the President Starfor's speech and also the continuing Virginia Tech story, even in Korea, by the way, where you would think that six-party talks would be the dominant news story, the government spent most of yesterday on this issue, on Virginia Tech. They had a National Security Council meeting. No Moo-hyun tried to call President Bush, but it wasn't, the White House told him it wasn't necessary. The Korean government's obviously very worried that this will somehow reflect badly on U.S.-Korea relations or on Korean Americans, which of course it won't and it shouldn't. There will be attention to the Korean American community. My sense so far is the press has been overwhelmingly positive about the Korean American community because it's such a success story. But in Seoul, as well, this is overwhelmingly the story right now, and is consuming the embassy here, but also the Blue House and the Foreign Ministry. So thank you for coming and hearing us out on where we are on the six-party talks and the February 13th agreement. John is going to talk about things that go bang,
hopefully don't go bang,
or hopefully don't go bang, or went bang. I'm going to talk about gossip and hearsay and who's up and who's down and all the easy stuff. How we got here diplomatically, where we are, in my view, and what is likely to come over the next week or two, and what I think we personally think we need to do. It's easy to speculate about why there was this shift in U.S. foreign policy towards North Korea, and there was a shift. You can draw the dots and see similar moves in the Middle East peace process, in other areas of foreign policy, and conclude, just sort of looking at the tea leaves, that because of the difficulty in Iraq, because of the democratic control of the Congress, the administration is battening down the hatches, cutting deals and sort of buying time where it can around the world and focusing primarily on Iraq. And although I was in the administration for 5 years reading the press, I had that impression too. I think there is another story that explains, though, why the shift happened. And I think that's because after the North Korean nuclear test of October last year, the U.S., for the first time in quite a while, had some real leverage, some real cards to use. Because of the North Korean nuclear test, China and the U.S. were essentially in the same position. The Chinese came out publicly in favor of sanctions before the U.S. did after the nuclear test. And Ambassador Wang, the Chinese ambassador in New York, ambassador to the UN, said, "We will have sanctions." The Chinese agreed to a sanction, so did the other parties. So we had 1718, which gave the international community the ability to place sanctions on North Korean WMD-related trade, weapons, and luxury goods, which is a pretty broad category. We had Banco Delta Asia and Macau, which was a $25 million pot of money for North Korea, but very importantly caused the entire international banking system to stop taking North Korean money, which was a very powerful financial sanction effect. And we had the Chinese debating, including many senior scholars close to the government, policies ranging from more pressure and more sanctions to even regime change. So the North Koreans were really under considerable pressure and faced the potential of a lot more pressure. And the U.S. had an ability to use this. And I think the president, looking at the next 2 years, realizing that North Korea is not going to eliminate its nuclear weapons program completely, looked for an opportunity to get a piece of it before the clock runs out on the administration, and to use this leverage and the closer cooperation with China in particular to get North Korea to cry uncle on at least one piece and get a process going towards full denuclearization. And the piece was Yongbyon. So the agreement is designed very specifically so that in the first 60 days, North Korea is supposed to shut down its reactor at Yongbyon. And the 5 other parties, but basically South Korea and China, would provide 50,000 tons of heavy fuel oil. There would be another 950,000 tons in subsequent stages. And then working groups would begin in 5 areas: denuclearization, replacing the armistice that ended the Korean War with a peace mechanism, a Northeast Asian multilateral discussion or process towards establishing a broader multilateral institution, energy cooperation, which is essentially, what and how to get North Korea the other fuel oil and what they need that's non-nuclear for their energy needs, and finally the normalization process with Japan and the U.S. Although normalization between Japan and the DPRK or the U.S. and DPRK is virtually impossible in the next 2 years, getting that process going. And those were all supposed to flow. And then after the 60 days, as you know, North Korea was supposed to dismantle Yongbyon, provide a declaration of all of its nuclear facilities, including the HEU program, and move towards further denuclearization, although there weren't clear deadlines or timelines for the subsequent stages. I thought the February 13th agreement was pretty well constructed. It had a deadline. It had pressure. It had consequences. I think we got off the rails, though, in implementation pretty quickly. And the problem was that, although not explicitly mentioned in the 6-party agreement, the U.S. had committed to return the $25 million from Banco Delta Asia as one of the conditions for getting the process going. And that, I think, knocked us off the rails and got us into that very familiar pattern with North Korea that we fell into after the agreed framework of paying them for process and getting into a discussion about what the U.S. has to do next for North Korea, rather than what North Korea has to do to live up to its obligations. And we very quickly, in a tactical way, let the initiative slip. Banco Delta Asia and the decision to return the money, I found puzzling. The Financial Times quoted me. I got a lot of angry calls from former colleagues, not for my quote, but for talking to Dimitri. But I thought it was problematic, frankly, in a tactical sense. First, people like me, for some time, had been told by our bosses in the White House when I was in the government to say, we will not pull our punches. We will not make compromises on law enforcement or human rights or other issues in order to keep the diplomacy going. These are separate issues. The denuclearization is critical, but so are these other issues, and we don't want North Korea to get the wrong lessons, that somehow it can use its nuclear weapons program to get us to accommodate them or accept them in terms of their illegal behavior, their human rights, or their missile programs. Secondly, I believe that the Banco Delta Asia sanctions had a powerful effect on North Korea in terms of counterproliferation. The North Koreans, to keep their their light water reactor, their HEU program going, have to procure very expensive, high-quality, dual-use materials, aluminum centrifuges and so forth. They have to buy chemical precursors for reprocessing. This is not the kind of thing that you barter in a dark alley in Dubai. These are things you buy from high-tech companies, preferably through a middleman, but you need cash. And the fact that the North Korean international financial system was gunked up made it a lot harder, I suspect, for them to use cash, use bank accounts, use dummy companies to procure high-tech dual-use materials to continue their nuclear weapons programs. And third, as I suggested earlier, I think this was problematic because we put the monkey back on our back. We made the question, what will the U.S. do next? And initially we said we'd give the money back to a bank account in China, in the Bank of China, and it would be used for humanitarian purposes, and the Chinese would help us monitor it. The Bank of China, not being foolish, being listed on the New York or International Stock Exchanges, said, we don't want the North Korean money because we don't want to be sanctioned. The Chinese wanted Treasury Department to pledge that they would not sanction any bank that took this money, but Treasury wasn't willing to do that. Our law won't allow us to do that, to give a kind of get-out-of-jail free card. Then we agreed to give it all back, but the North Koreans now are, I am told, demanding that they have not only the right to withdraw the money from BDA, but to transfer it to another bank account. Why? Because they want to reopen their international financial transactions, their ability to move money. So that's where the North Koreans are right now. It's not entirely surprising that they're demanding that they have the option to both withdraw the money and also transfer it. It's not surprising that there's no movement on Yongbyon. There was a press report yesterday that there was a satellite image of a truck going into Pyongyang, but there's no indication at all that the North Koreans are seriously doing anything. And if they were, they would contact the IAEA. So I don't think there's any movement on Yongbyon that we can report. And it's not surprising that they would try to drag the process out, use the process to get acceptance of North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, and then try to negotiate on the margins. And in fact, the North Koreans said in public statements several times before and after the test that they were prepared to enter into peaceful coexistence and engage in arms control negotiations with other nuclear powers. I think the U.S. And the administration is now pretty much at the end of its rope, has let this go as far as it can. You saw yesterday Sean McCormick saying the ball is in North Korea's court. We've done as much as we can. I do not think the administration is going to make any more compromises. I don't think the administration is going to try to make it possible for North Korea to transfer the money to Bank of China or other entities, because that would mean the Treasury Department promising it won't sanction these other banks ever for this kind of thing. And I just don't see us doing that. And I think Sean McCormick and also the Rice call to Foreign Minister Sung Min Soon and others clearly signals, all right, enough already. Victor Cha in Pyongyang, I understand, delivered a similar message. Enough already. The U.S. is letting the deadline pass, but I think the real deadline will be when Prime Minister Abe comes next week. And I'd like to say just one or two things about where the other parties are, starting with Japan, because that's important. The Japanese government and press has been pretty much livid at this development, perhaps overreacting in some ways, worried about the abductee issue where the press thinks they see the U.S. shifting positions and not supporting Japan. I don't think that's the case, but the U.S. press, the administration's press position has been very quiet about abductees lately. But I think in discussions with the North Koreans, the U.S. continues to be clear that a resolution of the abductee issue is critical if Japan's going to play in this, and the U.S. understands that. I think the deeper concern is the concern that somehow North Korea is being given a pass, and that Japan, which is ready to put more pressure on, is being told to hold off. And I think given the fact that the North Koreans have let the deadline slip, Abe will be in a very strong position to say to the president on Thursday next week, okay, it's time to increase pressure. We've tested this. It's time to increase pressure. The North Koreans may appreciate that and may start moving on Yongbyon by then. We'll see. But I think that Abe is going to try to have a discussion with the president about whether or not the North Koreans are really taking the steps we expected. And frankly, I think the president will appreciate that, because he, I think, is in a position where he wants to test the North Koreans, but not let them just drag this out and play games. The South Korean government welcomed this shift in U.S. policy. They didn't call it that, per se, but I think Seoul and the Blue House were quite happy with this. President No got a little bump in the polls, up from 8% to somewhere around 12 or 13%. Yippee. He's gotten a much better bump from the free trade agreement. But the South Korean government's also being prudent. Right now there are North-South economic talks at the vice ministerial level going on, and the South Korean side is not promising expansion of the Kaesong project or food because they're waiting to see whether North Korea complies. And I think the message the North Koreans are hearing is just that. The Chinese government is a little bit unhappy with the U.S. over these sanctions. I think we've lost an opportunity with China. We had them very angry and indignant in October. We had to have some diplomacy. The Chinese expected that. But I think we've made them a little too complacent. And if there isn't a sense from Beijing that the U.S. is going to pressure North Korea, then China's not going to pressure North Korea. And so that may shift. But I think we're at a turning point now. The deadline has slipped. It was Saturday. When Abe comes on Thursday, if the North Koreans haven't moved on Yongbyon, and judging from what Sean McCormick said yesterday, I think the dialogue is going to shift back to pressure, as it should. Because I think the February 13th agreement will only work if it has real teeth, and we've defanged ourselves a little bit. Now we're at a place where we can put the fangs back in.
Thank you all for coming. I think this is a great example of how an organization like CSIS can be a big tent, because I have tremendous respect for Mike. I know that he knows much more about the inner workings of this administration, and having had much more responsibility in the government than I ever had. But I probably disagree on most of the points that he's gone through in terms of how what North Korea has done is a surprise, how we should be playing it in the future, and perhaps we'll have a chance to get into some of that in the question and answer. I mean, obviously, a big question on the nuclear side is, when is North Korea going to shut down this reactor? You know, it's a little bit like the U.S. tax deadline. You have to pay your taxes by April 15th in this country, no matter what. Unless April 15th falls on a Sunday, and then you have until the 17th. But, of course, if there's a big northeastern storm, then you get 2 extra days until the 19th, because sometimes circumstances come up. But the assumption is you're going to do the right thing. And for better or worse, the Bush administration, having made this shift, and I agree with Mike that there is a shift that's happened, we have to hope for the best. We have to be realistic about what we're going to get, and we have to prepare for the worst. But the assumption now is that North Korea wants to try and make this work. North Korea was testing our intentions and said, you want to make this work, we want the money back. We know it's dirty money, or you say it's dirty money, but that's your test of faith for us. It took us a while to get that done. And the North Koreans are going to, in my opinion, wait the exact number of days it took for that money to become available before they then implement their part of the agreement. It's a balance. They're trying to show we're the same as you. If you can take 63 days or 59 days to do what you're responsible for doing, then we can take 59 days or 62 days to do what we're responsible for doing. If they don't, I think it then becomes very clear that the North Koreans had no intention of implementing the agreement, but I don't think we're at that point yet. I don't think we can take their decision not to shut down the reactor in 60 days as a sign that they're not serious. I think they're also going to wait and see what the circumstances are going to be. Now, don't get me wrong. The North Koreans are going to take advantage of every crack, every opening they can. They're going to try and extract additional concessions. They're going to try and claim hardship or difficulties. And we have to be very resolute in saying, look, we understand that there were some circumstances that delayed our implementation. And I think the administration has been right in being not focused on the 60-day. I think we need to be realistic about how much time the North Koreans may push for. In my opinion, if I were running the show, I would say, if it took us an extra 30 days, let's give them an extra 30 days. But at that point, let's have our process in place to move forward. I think what's really interesting about this is that you don't have a lot of outcry in the United States, and as Mike said elsewhere, that the North Koreans haven't made this deadline. And I think that's because of the political circumstances that surround this deal. People have been pushing from the left and even from the center for President Bush to cut a deal, to engage with North Korea to try and make this process work. And now that he has done so, the criticism can't come from the engagement camp. The only criticism is coming really from the extreme isolationists, and really the only vocal person has been people like John Bolton. And my response to that is, you know, he had 6 years. His results were not what I would consider to be outstanding, and so I'm not really sure what he's offering except more of the same. And I've heard this as well from other people that I know Mike knows much better than I, that they feel, you know, we were finally getting somewhere with North Korea. We had finally cut off the money. We finally had the fangs in. We were finally putting the screws to them, and now we let them off the hook. And, you know, you never know the right answer. You know, did we let them off the hook and we were about to get what we wanted, or did we have a failing strategy that had to change? I don't think we'll ever know the answer, and I think we're now destined for an extended process of negotiation and I think a painful process of trying to implement this agreement. But I think that's where we are, and we've got to now live with that. If the North Koreans demonstrate that they're not prepared to implement their side of the bargain, and that'll come up, I think, soon enough, then we're left with the same options we were left with before, and quite frankly, none of them are particularly attractive. Now, you know, that being said, and while I have great respect for Ambassador Hill, you know, I have very little sympathy for the position the administration's in, because in my opinion, they could have had a much better agreement much earlier. In my opinion, the agreed framework was better than what we currently have, and I know there's a big debate on that. But my concern about this agreement is that it's an extremely loosely negotiated agreement. And I appreciate that if you're in, you want to have some flexibility. But to my opinion, the agreement doesn't learn the lessons we should have been learning over the past 15, 20 years of negotiating with North Korea. There's very little detail in terms of what exactly has to happen when. Terms are used and they're not defined. We leave it up to North Korea to work with the IAEA based on their mutual agreement, but we know they hate each other and they don't work very well together. There's no conflict resolution process. It's basically said, you'll do this, and if you don't, well, but at the working level, there are always problems that come up. And these are the things we learned the hard way in the agreed framework that I would have liked to see incorporate into the agreement itself. I know that at the working group levels, they're working on these issues. The people working this issue are extremely competent, but we've set up a structure which gives North Korea the ability to continue to poke at us and to continue to try and define the agreement to their advantage, and I think that's going to be a problem. And I'll get into some of what I mean in terms of the specifics on the reactor. Let me talk a little bit about the things that go bang or the things that don't go bang, hopefully. There are a number of things that North Korea has to do to satisfy the United States and to satisfy the other parties in the six-party talks. The first, obviously, is to shut down the reactor. I get asked all the time, what does it take to shut down a reactor? I was sort of amused by the report yesterday that there was a truck and some activity at Yongbyon. You push a couple of buttons and you flip a couple of switches and the reactor shuts down. It's designed to shut down if there's a safety problem quickly. Technically, what has to happen is that control rods need to be inserted into the reactor, which will absorb the excess neutrons so that the chain reaction stops. That's something that North Korea has done lots of times. They know how to do it. They could do it today if they wanted to. So it's a political decision, not a technical challenge. Mike is right to point out that one of the things we'll see in advance of that is the IAEA. North Korea should invite the IAEA back in to monitor this, but it's not specified in the agreement when that has to happen. Does the IAEA have to be there when they shut down the reactor? We almost went to war over the fact in 1994 that North Korea wanted to remove fuel from the reactor without the IAEA present. Well, at what point does the IAEA have to be invited back? Do they have to be there in perpetuity? Can they have a weak visa and then be kicked out? Again, the agreement isn't specific. We know what we assume to be correct, and I'm sure we have verbal discussions. We've clearly said to the North Koreans what we expect, but it's not defined, and this gives the North Koreans opportunities to, I think, follow up correctly what Mike has said. We've now put ourselves back in the position of having to pay to play, and I think the North Koreans are going to take advantage of that in every opportunity. So the reactor, it shuts down. Then you have the question of, before you even get to disablement, or I've asked Korean colleagues what the term is defined in Korean. I guess it's to render impotent and not be able to operate. But before we can get to that point, there are a lot of questions. For example, there are 8,000 fuel rods in the reactor. It contains about 10 to 13 kilograms of plutonium. That's enough for 2 or 3 additional nuclear weapons. What happens to that fuel? Can North Korea pull the fuel out and reprocess it? Can they do that without the IAEA present? Do we have to go in and recan the fuel as we did during the 1990s? That was a 3, 4, 5-year process. North Korea extracted a tremendous amount of concessions, nothing really strategically significant, but they used that fuel as a lever to motivate the U.S. on certain issues. That's completely undefined, and I'm worried that that's going to be an extended, drawn-out process that we yet have to face. So we have the reactor. You have the fuel in the reactor. Once the reactor shuts down, it'll take some time for that fuel to be accessible. It's physically hot to the touch. It needs to be cooled down with the gas that's used to cool the reactor. It may be a matter of weeks before that fuel can be removed, but then there's a big question that comes up. And I expect that North Korea will try and use that fuel as a lever point. North Korea is very good at getting our attention when they want it. Nuclear fuel is a really good way to get the world's attention. And if the heavy fuel oil hasn't been delivered in time, if they feel they're entitled to have the money transferred to a different bank account as opposed to just released, that fuel can be a very attractive, tempting way for North Korea to do it. I would advise, and I know that people like Governor Richardson, and I'm sure that Victor Cha gave North Korea very clear advice that we've got to build some momentum. If they're serious about this process, they should follow through. But it's going to be tempting, and I think we have to be prepared for North Korea to try and use that to their advantage. Once we get that fuel dealt with, let's assume for a second they shut down the reactor, and let's assume we get some sort of satisfactory approach on the fuel. We have the whole question of disablement of the reactor. What we want is to prevent North Korea from being able to turn that reactor back on. We want to remove that from their toolbox of leverage, points of leverage. How do we do that? Very smart people in the Department of Energy and elsewhere in the U.S. have come up with a number of very creative, sometimes very basic ways of making that reactor inoperable. My favorite is pouring concrete into the holes where the spent fuel goes. It's very hard to go back down into radioactive channels and dig out concrete after it's set. Other people want to tear the reactor down to the studs for a number of reasons, both because it makes it harder to repair and because there's information you can gain by the tearing down of the reactor. North Korea, on the other hand, I'm sure, and this comes as no surprise, will want to do as little as possible to say, well, let's put an IAEA seal on that. That's good enough. That's disablement. Because we would never break a seal, of course. I'd be more than happy to break a seal when the time comes. Let's put a padlock on the door. We'll give you a set of the keys. There will be all sorts of things that North Korea will say are satisfactory. And again, we will have a long, drawn-out process where I'm sure the North Koreans will say, what's it worth to you? And we're going to have to either be very resolute in saying it's worth nothing to us because we have a process in place, and be prepared to walk away from the agreement, which I'm not sure the entire administration is unified on. Some people would probably be very happy with that. Or are we prepared to make additional compromises? Short of concrete, maybe we can pour Jell-O, which is a little easier to clear out. So we have a number of major technical and political challenges that are interlinked, which I think is going to ensure that we will have another conference like this in a couple of months. I haven't even gotten to a number of the other issues that affect our ability to be confident that the North Korean nuclear program is not continuing. The question of the enrichment program is clearly one of tremendous interest. I think that there are very straightforward ways around that. We have a general sense of what we believe North Korea has acquired. When North Korea makes their declaration, we will cross-check that. Will it match up? If it doesn't, we have a problem. We should be encouraging North Korea and even helping them to understand that that process is going to be a very careful one and maybe even a very intrusive one. I think they understand that, but this is an opportunity for them to prove their bona fides. There's a question about fresh nuclear fuel that could go into the reactor. There's a fuel fabrication facility at Yongbyon. If they pull the fuel out of the nuclear reactor, is there another core ready to go in? If we can't disable the reactor quickly, can we at least get that fuel someplace that it's secure? Maybe a long distance from Yongbyon. Maybe in a place where it can be observed if it's going to move from point A to point B. Those are things we could do that, again, would help build momentum, would not ensure the reactor never operates, but I think we're going to have to learn to crawl before we can run at this point. The last point I'll mention is then the question of people. There are a sizable number, hundreds, probably thousands of people in the North Korean nuclear complex. They know how to operate this facility. They know how to run this facility. If necessary, they know how to tear down this facility. And at some point, we're going to want and need to gain access and to work with those people. History demonstrates, although we can discuss whether the agreed framework is a good lesson or a bad lesson to draw from, but at least from my perspective, the history of the agreed framework is that when you have a political deal at the top, the people down in the middle and even at the bottom comply to the benefit of the North Korean system. It's a police state, a Stalinist cult of personality state, but when the focus of that cult says walk, people walk. And so when they say help the Americans or the IAEA or the Sixth Party shut down the reactor, it shuts down. And so again, we have to stay very focused on getting our point to the top and ensuring that the top leadership and Kim Jong-il himself understands that the opportunity exists. I think it should be a little bit more open a window than just the next couple of weeks, but I don't think it should extend much beyond that. I'll leave my comments there and then invite questions.
Let's take some questions out, you guys.
Dimitri Sevastopoulos, Financial Times. Do you think the receiving the 25 million back, even if it's not going to be transferred elsewhere, will actually make a difference to the North Koreans if at the end of the day American banks and other banks around the world don't allow them to participate in the financial system? I mean, what does 25 million give them?
$25 million is a lot of walk-around money for Kim Jong-il to distribute to the elite. One of the things we learned from defectors over the past few years is that Kim Jong-il has less glow to his cult of personality than his father Kim Il-sung did, and he compensates with nice packages of cognac and Mercedes-Benz and so forth, which is why luxury goods were listed in the Security Council sanction, just to make the point that the elite will be affected by this, not the North Korean people. So it has some effect, but you're right that their real interest is the broader banking system. They want the ability to set up bank accounts. The estimates are that about half of the BDA money was legit. which is to say it was used for exporting of mushrooms, magnesium, other deals. And the other half came from money that was laundered from counterfeit $100 bills, counterfeit cigarettes, counterfeit Viagra, and drugs. If the North Koreans want the legitimate trade to be moving through the international banking system, there are ways to do it. And I believe the administration is willing to talk to the North Koreans in this diplomatic process about what steps they have to do to reassure the international financial system that their money is clean. But I don't detect that the administration is willing to a priori say, you have a clean bill of health, we're going to tell bankers around the world. Treasury has backed off a bit in their work around the world, asking banking centers not to take North Korean money or to scrutinize it carefully. But the effect is still there. And I think there's enough publicity about this and enough public records, enough court cases, and so forth, that banks around the world, banking regulators, for reasons of due diligence, are going to be extremely cautious until the North Koreans take proactive and clear steps to give them confidence.
Just a comment on that. I mean, I think Mike is exactly right. The United States should not be in a position of being the North Koreans' banker, nor should we vouch for them. I think we should be willing to hold out in the future that if we engage in the process we want to engage in, normalization of relations, denuclearization, satisfaction on other issues, we can then be that facilitator. We're happy to be. We'd like to see North Korea open up economically because we think it's going to undermine the regime, and once the crack opens, it's going to be harder to sustain that system. But I think we should not be put in that position. At the same point, we shouldn't allow issues like this, counterfeiting, illicit trade, to prevent us from dealing with the big security issue. I agree with the president. We shouldn't stand by when people counterfeit American currency. The greenback's the greenback. But we also shouldn't stand by when countries build and test nuclear weapons, and we got to choose. And for me, it's a fairly easy choice. At the same side, I think we also have to be realistic about the type of interactions we already have with North Korea. American money goes to North Korea. For years, when we have been going to recover the bodies of MIAs, we have been paying for that service. That's a long-standing process that goes back through multiple administrations. We've paid much more than $25 million over the years. And so, again, I think we have to keep things in perspective. It's not for me to say whether that's a right expenditure or bad expenditure of money, but we pay for things that are worth it to us. The North Koreans said this money was worth it to them, but I don't think we should go so far as to be their stamp of approval.
Just to be clear, that money for the MIA, POW MIA remains, was paid for the nominally operating costs for U.S. Service personnel to go in and look for the remains. The U.S. stopped paying that 2 years ago, which is partly why Richardson went, because they had remains and they wanted some reward, and the reward they got was Bill Richardson. So. I do not believe that they paid any money. I think the face aspect of having Richardson go and all of that was the reward.
Think only about how you control, these financial metrics on BDA, or did you think through the process of, if the North comes back to talk, if they conduct their banking system, how would we unravel this and what the money go forward? So the rationale for that question is, it seems to me unbelievable that having thought about this for so long, having had the BDA situation in place for over a year, that when the time came to sort of discuss with North Korea, okay, we'll give back the money, that people were like confounded about how complicated everything was. So that's the first question. The second one is, you talked about, it may be time, soon time, to heighten that pressure to go in North Korea. I mean, how can you possibly have credibility doing that? We've gone through what we've gone through in the last couple of months. And finally, what exactly is the point at which the North Koreans would receive the first atomic receiver? I mean, is it when the IAEA goes in and the reactor is shut down? Is it the point at which the question about the
Doing them in reverse order, as John said, the specifics of this agreement are not that clear. I think it is fundamentally difficult to negotiate an agreement with North Korea that looks like a contract that would pass, Harvard Law School contract law seminars. It just ain't going to happen. And it's actually, I think, impressive that this February 13th agreement has as much specificity as it does in terms of commitments. But there's always going to be huge question marks under even the most explicit agreement with North Korea. I think that's one reason why you need some sticks. You need some consequences for noncompliance. I don't think you can have easily with North Korea an arbitration clause or recourse to go to the international court. You have to have some consequences that are not built into the agreement, but that are understood by the other parties. And I think we have them potentially in Resolution 1718, which has, according to the UN Security Council Sanctions Committee, been implemented in part by 31 countries, full stop. So we have the ability, if we want to start talking in the Security Council about the next stage, which would be drawing up an entities list, which you're supposed to do when you do these sanctions, of which entities, individuals are sanctioned. We could, Chris Hill was in the region recently, looking for an opportunity to, I think, meet with the North Koreans and try to keep things going. We could, in future, on those kinds of meetings, make it very clear we're talking to our allies about what steps we will take to begin the process of drawing up the entities list. There's a lot of movement that we could be making that wouldn't even necessarily involve sanctions per se, that we're not doing. And I think that's what's going to have to happen and may well happen now. It doesn't mean you immediately start moving the 7th Fleet off of North Korea. There's a lot of things we could do to signal that there will be consequences. Fuel is not, in general, I think the understanding is when the IAEA says, thumbs up, they have turned off the reactor, which is something you can verify. I think that's probably the green light for the heavy fuel oil to begin moving. I think John raises some very important complications and question marks. I don't think those issues are likely to stop the heavy fuel oil, the first 50,000. I don't know if you agree, but I think on the pressure and credibility, I think I sort of answered that. We're getting to the point where we lost a lot of credibility because we look like we're bending over backwards. That could be an asset. We could use that now to say to the Chinese, look, we've gone as far as we can go. We're really out there, and now we're mad. So it's not a full loss that we've gone down this route. We can express sadness and shock rather than anger, but make it clear that our next mood will be anger. And in terms of the complications with returning the money, I think Treasury understood full well how complicated this would be, and that the diplomatic process with the North Koreans makes it very difficult to get into the details. When you're sitting down with Kim Dae-gwan or Lee Gun or one of the other North Korean negotiators, they have an extremely limited brief. I've seen them across the table. They have talking points. They can't stray from them. Maybe they'll let you know something interesting on the side, but it's very hard in these essentially political negotiations to get into the details. I think Treasury knew very well and explained to the North Koreans how complicated this would be. The North Koreans heard in the diplomatic process what they wanted to hear, announced after the Berlin talk, I think it was after Berlin, that they were told they would get all the money. That's not what Treasury was telling them. So there's a certain amount in the negotiating process of the North Koreans of hearing what they want to hear, announcing that's the agreement, and then demanding it, even though Treasury and other officials, I think, made it clear to them how our law works. But of course, North Korea is not a rule of law country. As John said, it's a Stalinist system, and they believe that if the leader says, violate all your laws and principles, it can be easily done. So they probably had high expectations that weren't met.
Anecdotally, thinking back all the way back to 1994, when we signed the agreed framework, President Clinton had to send a side letter to Kim Jong-il saying that the United States would, in full compliance with its own domestic laws, work for the provision of light water reactors. And we had a long, extended session explaining to them we have a Congress and what that actually means. So there's definitely an education curve with the North Koreans when it comes to, President Bush or President Clinton or, President Green can make the decision, but we've got a process to go through. And I may be naive, or at least I'm realistic in thinking that I don't rule out the possibility the North Koreans are ready to comply with this agreement, but they just want to make sure there's balance, that they're not somehow losing face because they had to move in a shorter time span than the United States got to move in terms of the money release. And so I've got a date out there. I have to figure out which date it is. But after that point, I'm much, much closer to Mike in terms of how I think we have to proceed. And I think being prepared now, just along the lines that he mentioned, having Ambassador Hill be in the region specifically for what happens if we don't continue down this path is a very important process.
I just say this will disappoint you, John, but I actually don't think we disagree on that point. I think the North Koreans probably will run that calculation. I think they probably will shut off Yongbyon. What worries me is that they'll extract as much as they can for that, so that the next phase, which is the one that really matters, the declaration, the HEU, the dismantlement, because you can turn it back on again too, right? Just as easily as you turned it off. So the disablement and the declaration, that's the hard part, and that's the part I personally think the North Koreans have no intention of implementing during this administration, or ever if they can help it, and which is why we need to be starting sending these signals now. But I do think they will. I think there's a better than 50-50 chance they will shut down myself. But.
So, sorry to truncate,
Yeah.
but I mean, do you think? You think that they'll shut down the reactor, but they won't go as far as disablement under this administration. Do you think, under any circumstances, if we really made let's say for a second the price was no object and politically we were prepared to pay, politically, diplomatically, economically, do you think that calculation is we're going to get a better deal out of the next administration?
I think the North Koreans don't want to give up their nuclear weapons. They want to dissipate the pressure from 1718, and this is a way to do it, and that'll buy them some time to see what they get in 2008. And they may get, Newt Gingrich, or they may get Richardson. And so, from their perspective, if they can take the heat and maybe even dissipate it, why not?
There's nothing more we can do. But I don't understand, eventually who will back down? That North Korea will decide to pay cash, or China or the U.S. will have to do something to go over this. Then we can talk about the shutdown of the nuclear reactor things afterwards. So first, I'd like to know more. Eventually, what will happen then for North Korea? This issue is really resolved. And the second thing is, John mentioned that the U.S. doesn't want to be and shouldn't be North Korea's banker. I think neither does China. So can you shed some light on the communication between U.S. and China on this issue? And also, China tends to have more patience on international issues like Iran or Sudan. So as things continue to develop, do you think China will still see eye to eye with the U.S. and Japan on the six-party framework, or China would think that, well, we can wait longer?
I think that technically, the administration believes that technically now North Korea can, and the North Korean entities, Taedong Bank and others, can go to BDA and they can take out their money. The problem is they can't transfer it to the Bank of China or HSBC or Presidential Savings or Citibank because nobody will take it. And what the North Koreans want is the right to transfer the money so they can start getting back to business as normal. And that's not going to happen. This, I think, is a point of friction between the U.S. and China because, don't forget, BDA is a Chinese bank. It's in Macau. And the Chinese are, on a point of principle, unhappy that the U.S. can use its sovereign laws to sanction one of their banks. So on that point of principle, the U.S. and China have a little friction. And I suspect the North Koreans know that and are trying to play that gap as much as they can. Overall, I think the Chinese position shifted quite a bit after the missile and nuclear tests last summer and fall. They used to, early on when I was in the administration, they worried more about us than North Korea. That was actually fine because we could scare Beijing into acting and pressuring North Korea. I think now they worry more about North Korea as the unpredictable actor. But it's a difficult problem for China, and it's hotly contested, I think, in Beijing. And if there's an opportunity for Beijing to say, it's not our job right now, it's Washington's, they'll take it. And that's where they've been for the past 2 months.
Become fodder for North Korean haggling and wrangling, even though again, the clearance of the $25 million wasn't really in the agreement, there was an implicit connection. So North Korea could spin that out, and more basically, what do you know about whether there had been any effect of this VDA thing on actual North Korean crime and counter, secondary issue of is North Korea still counterfeiting, for example, and other aspects, or did that have a chilling effect?
Taiwan and other governments have put out notices saying don't use $100 bills, even recently. So the money, the counterfeit money is in the system. Whether or not the North Koreans are, using the printing presses still, I don't know. My guess is they'd be very careful. In the 2002-2003 timeframe, they got caught a lot. They got caught with the Pongsu in Australia with heroin. They got caught in this sting operation with counterfeit cigarettes and money in the U.S. They got caught in Singapore, Japan. They got caught a lot. You don't hear about it as much. I don't think it's because North Korea that they've all become temperance members and they're drinking tea and praying for salvation. I think it's because they're being more careful. Would be my guess. The North Koreans hate the sanctions, 17, of course. I think that's a hard target for them to hit. But they can certainly try to slow it down and declare, it's hostile and so forth. I think they'll pick other targets. John mentioned a couple in terms of the fuel and so forth. They could point to the terrorist sanctions and claim that they thought we were going to lift them, whereas what we said was we're going to explain to them what they have to do to get them lifted. They have complained about the U.S. ROK military maneuvers, ultra-focus lens and so forth. So they have a long list of grievances they can pull out and use as an obstacle, and they will. And as Gordon Flake says, the North Koreans, don't care about something until they do, and then they'll throw it forward. And Chris Hill says they care about something until they don't. So, they kind of use these things for tactical advantage. If we have movement towards sanctions, they will throw something up or complain of hostile policy. They will try to create a dynamic where we believe any pressure of any kind on any issue is an obstacle. And so it'll take some resolve, but most importantly, the other parties are going to have to see that the administration is determined incrementally to keep implementing these sanctions and not be deterred by North Korean rhetoric, because you can expect there will be some pushback. And to Carol's point, we've lost a little credibility on that because we were willing to compromise so much, but I still think that we are in a position where we could make it clear that we've enough already.
Could non-movement on the Japan working group, which seems to be the prospect of the time being, also be another one of those issues that they could see on?
Yeah, the Japanese government, I think, would like to fully implement 1718. And we've pulled it back halfway. There's some implementation, but we're not, we haven't had the sanctions committee meeting to do the entities list and so forth. I think Abe's a believer, and the Japanese government broadly is a believer, that we need more pressure. And I think that'll be part, I suspect that will be part of his message. The working group with Japan is really rather pathetic. The Japanese have sent a very distinguished diplomat, Haraguchi. The North Koreans have sent a very low-level guy named Song, who, after an hour, tells the Japanese that they're unrepentant, militarists, and walks out. They're not going well at all. I think that the North Koreans believe they can isolate Japan and treat them that way because of the nature of the dynamics we're now in. I think it's very important that the administration, when Abe comes, signal that we're with Japan 100% on the abductees. Not just that the diplomacy won't move forward till Japan's satisfied, but that we're with Japan on this issue. And we need to signal that more clearly, because the signals we've been sending, it's not a change in policy, but the tone has been different. And we've been signaling that, Japan is going to be an obstacle unless this is solved, which is a little different from saying what we used to say. Vice President Cheney said it in Japan, Negroponte said it in Japan, but we generally don't say it very much these days, which is, we're with Japan on this one. This is, unacceptable. I think we need to give a little more face and back up to the Japanese talks. And that's another thing Abe will probably hope to get out of the visit.
Let me just make a slight comment on whether North Korea will fixate on another point and try to throw that up. Of course they will, and the process of North Korea has basically been divided into 3 camps, really 4 camps. There the people said you're never going to get a deal, so don't even bother playing the game. I think that approach has been tried early on and really hasn't worked. You got the other camp that says, okay, let's do a little to sort of provide some cover for ourselves, but we know it's going to fail, so don't really extend yourself out. On the other side, you've got, look, just negotiate with these guys. Everything's going to be fine. And I think that's also been proven to be totally wrong. And then there's my camp, which is do everything you possibly can that doesn't compromise your security to make it impossible for the North Koreans to get on the moral high ground. So the Treasury action against BDA, as you can call it uncoordinated, you can call it conspiracy, whatever you want, basically put us in a position where the North Koreans could throw up a smoke screen and say, see, they're not serious, and we've got to eliminate all that. Because in the end, if we're able to put ourselves in that position where we've done everything we can and the allies understand that, and the North Koreans balk, then we're in a much better position to do 1718. We're in a much better position to put pressure on the Chinese. We're in a much better position to put pressure on South Korea. When I go to South Korea and I talk to my friends and colleagues there, I said, look, you may not want us to really go all the way because I don't trust North Korea is going to do this. And then where's the engagement policy? You then become much more divided from the United States. And that's a problem for you. So you have to be prepared, be careful what you wish for. And I think we're going to get to that point where we can test the North Koreans again to see if they're prepared to reevaluate whether North Koreans are or not in their interests. I think we should make a really good case to them that it's not in their interests. But I don't think we've done a very good job of that so far.
I think the difference between us is the balance of how much you need to be liked versus how much you need to be feared. And I'd like to be a little more feared than we are.
Yeah.
I like to be liked. I'd like to be a little more feared.
Although, as you know, and you said, we are pretty feared. Probably not as much now because of Iraq and because, but people. When I used to go to, I haven't been to South Korea in about a year, but I used to go, and the first question was, is the U.S. going to bomb? Nobody asks that question anymore, I don't think, because they understand what Iraq really means for us. So I agree with you. I think we do need to be feared. I think people do need to take us seriously. But at the same point, we do need to play, not to be liked, but to at least make it harder for the North Koreans to be liked more than we're liked. And, when North Korea is seen as less of a problem than the United States, we've got a problem. And that's not just a window dressing problem. That's a content problem.
In 2002, when the president went to Korea and said to the press, I'm not going to attack North Korea. We got a huge bump out of that.
Right.
So, anyway.
We'll have a transcript out of this briefing later, and thanks for being here with us this morning at Center for Strategic and International Studies.